Hello and welcome to this edition of Panorama, bringing you the topical debates in the UK and around the Western world. In this episode, we will be discussing the issue of freedom of speech in wake of the France shootings. Joining me in the studio to discuss this topic, we are joined by Hasfa Mustafa, a journalist and political analyst. And we are also joined by Euan Grant, a security intelligence analyst. And over the phone, we are also joined by Elizabeth Jones, the UKIP prospective parliamentary candidate in Dartford. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, my first question is to you, Hasfa. And of course, what's happened with in Paris with the shootings of the journalist in the Charlie Hebdo magazine. Of course, we don't need to go into the fact whether it was right or wrong. I mean, it's quite unanimously that this was something wrong. What happened, the killings were wrong. But there was the other bigger issue that came about in all of this, and that was the issue of free speech. Now, the first question to you is it right for these journalists, these cartoonists in Charlie Hebdo or anywhere else, are they right to pick the profits in the way they have done? Is that something, is it right? Is it wrong? What is it in your opinion?
Well, I think first and foremost we need to establish what political satire is and what it's about. And the aim of political satire is actually to target the powers that be, the powerful in any society. In France, the Muslim population is in fact essentially working class. They're not present at the highest echelons of power. You don't see many Muslims in government. You don't see them in the top institutions. So they are misrepresented. They're not represented at the highest levels of power. And therefore they are a weak minority. And it doesn't fit into what political satire is to actually target a weak minority. In the same way that it wouldn't really be very honourable for a political satirist to actually simply focus and target travellers here in the UK. It doesn't make sense. Now, of course, in the name of freedom of expression, we should be able to say anything. That is the definition we've been led to believe. But the reality is, of course, in particular in France, France has some of the most repressive legislation on freedom of expression. Now, you have something such as the Guessot law, which basically establishes that if anyone questions the official narrative on the Second World War, and in particular on the Holocaust, they can actually be subjected to 5 years imprisonment for simply questioning a historical event.
We'll come to the issue of, what you're saying right now is, what they're doing with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons are targeting Muslims and using the cloak of freedom of speech, under the cover of freedom of speech.
Absolutely, yes. And just to go back on whether the cartoons are right or wrong, I think they were wrong because they're not remotely bringing anything to the debate. They're essentially being offensive. They're targeting a part of the population and simply offending for the sake of offence. Now, they're very, very similar. They're exactly almost the same, in fact, to the cartoons you would have seen in the 30s in Germany, where the only thing, the way the Jews were represented were big nose, crooked, looking devious. There was nothing funny about it. There was no message to it. It was essentially to humiliate the Jews. And Charlie Hebdo goes very much into that line, which is essentially exclusively, in fact, to humiliate the Muslim population. And the idea is, here is freedom of speech, and if you don't like it, well, tough.
Okay, Euan, I'll go to you now. You heard what Hassan just said, and it's more about, these cartoons are more about targeting, vilifying, demonising Muslims and Islam. So do you think, in your opinion, were these cartoons right to have been published?
Well, I do think that freedom of expression is a near absolute, and I notice particularly Hafsa's comments about the extreme hypocrisy in France. You get also similarly in Germany. I would say, though, that the Charlie Hebdo crossed the line, I would argue, in the depictions of the Prophet, but had it held back and criticised aspects of Islam, it would have been within its rights. And so I would broadly say they should publish, but not go quite that far as they did. And I would point out, as I've made to a number of people, it's not that long ago that depictions of Jesus Christ were not allowed in Western media, albeit as much by social practice as by law.
But the real question is what they're doing, is this freedom to insult also part of freedom of speech?
I think ultimately, yes, that the answer is yes. That is, I think, an absolute.
And to insult someone you feel something would be right? Would be something within the law? I mean, in an age where we talk about civilization, I mean, surely is this something civilized to insult others and offend others, but to depict them in such a way, you're just provoking more and more anger and more extremism.
How long is a piece of string? To criticise, yes, to insult, and where is that line? And ultimately, of course, that is ultimately to courts, both civil and criminal, to judge within the interpretation of the law.
Sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I'd like to say something, because this idea that even insulting is part of freedom of speech is not right. Simply because if you look at in this country, if I use beyond that, even according to the law, if I was to refer to homosexuals as faggots or depict them as some sort of depraved community, it would be wrong, or I would get the sack as a journalist if I wrote and it described them in that way. So offence does actually, even in this country, fall under the realms of the law. And I don't think it's easy to say, well, in the name of freedom of expression, there are no holds barred, because there are minorities, rather, in this country, as well as across the Western world, that are protected, and they're not in this way insulted in the way Muslims are. And again, it actually highlights the double standard. So, like I said, if you target any group of any minority, and in particular, say homosexuals, for example, the gay community, and you describe them in an insulting manner, then that is not acceptable. So why should it be acceptable for the Muslims to accept that kind of insult?
Do you want to come back to that very quickly?
I would just say it's not acceptable that they should have to accept that. It's where the line is drawn. And I would argue that the magazine overstepped the mark in deliberately depicting the Prophet, but would not have done so had it produced similar cartoons which did not breach that Islamic prohibition.
Okay, Elizabeth, now on to you, and you've heard our two guests. What is your opinion? Should people be allowed to publish these cartoons depicting the prophets in a very insulting manner? Do you think that's within free speech, and do you think that's something okay?
Well, if we look at the Charlie Hebdo magazine, if we look at its history, we have to understand that it's been sued 13 times by Roman Catholic organisations, once by an Islamic organisation, and in 2009 it sacked one of its employees for alleged anti-Semitism, for suggesting that, I think, Nicolas Sarkozy's son married some Jewish heiress and converted to Judaism in order to profit financially. So it does have quite a history of being anti-establishment and anti-religion. So I think it's got a broad brush approach. So UKIP is pro-freedom of expression. Within the United Kingdom, of course, freedom of expression is governed by the Public Order Act 1986 and the Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006. So if people are upset, then it's a matter, it could be a civil matter or indeed a criminal matter for them to engage the public authorities.
But wouldn't you say this is, this is bigotry and hatred? This is not something where, someone could say, well, this is my opinion, this is my criticism of a religion or a person. This is actually, beyond that. This is something which is fueling a lot of hatred, and also, it's depicting, a man who is an Arab in a very stereotypical way. So by many people, they see this as something which is very, very offensive, to the point where it's only actually making things worse.
Well, let me give you an example. In 2011, on Palm Sunday, 4 youngsters aged 18 to 25 walked into an Avignon gallery. They beat the guard with a hammer and a sock, and they smashed up a piece of work to pieces. Now, that piece of work was Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. It was a photograph of Jesus Christ submerged under the artist's urine. This had caused mass protest. There were about 1,000 protesters marching against it. Indeed, the French culture minister at the time, Mitterrand, condemned this attack as an attack on freedom of expression. And also we had a similar situation with a Swedish set of photographs called Ecce Homo by Elizabeth Wallen. She exhibited these. These were Jesus Christ depicted as a gay man. And in Serbia in 2012, there were mass marches against these pieces of art as they were deemed to be blasphemous and insulting. So it's around the world, religious passions run high, I understand that, but no religion is exempt from this treatment, and indeed no religion is exempt from satire, criticism, ridicule or debate. That's an unfortunate nature of human expression. You will be insulting someone somewhere. And also, a freedom of expression, freedom of thought, however it may tread on people's toes at times, it is the wellspring of intellectual creativity. If we look at the example, let's say, of Galileo, Galileo espoused the theory of the heliocentric world. At the time, that was deemed to be extraordinarily insulting and blasphemous, to such a degree that he was subject to life house arrest and could never leave his home. He was deemed to be such a danger and so insulting to the existing religious paradigm.
But hold on there. But Galileo and others, they reach the stage of maturity. They have, when they do make, freedom of expression. This is different to what we're seeing right now, surely, because this isn't mature, this isn't civilized, this is just literally taking the fun, making the fun because you have the power to mock and insult others. You're just making things worse. You're making more people more extreme by seeing these images. You're not really advancing the civilized debate.
Okay, I just gave you the example of Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. What's your take on that?
Well, Hasfa, what's your take on that?
Yes, my take on that is that there is a fundamental difference in a majority Christian or Catholic country to actually mock an institution that is all-powerful. So when in France, Italy, or in Spain, where the church is actually incredibly powerful and remains powerful to this day, when you insult that institution as a political institution, not the religion, but the symbolism of it, then you are, again, this goes into what political satire is about. You're targeting the powerful. When you're targeting a minority essentially made up of working class immigrants, you are actually targeting the weak. So you can do that, of course, and go with the consequences. I mean, no one is struck down by lightning when they do that. And of course, when they are killed, it is wrong. I think there's no ifs or buts about that. But I think it is morally repugnant because there is no kudos in doing that. You are targeting the weak. It's a bit like having the big bully showing off his force in the playground by targeting the weaker kid with the glasses. There is no honor in that. And I think that has to be recognized and established. When you're in a Christian majority country and you're targeting the Christian church, it isn't remotely the same as actually targeting a minority. And Elizabeth actually, funnily enough, chose the example of the cartoonist who was sacked for insulting Jews. That means that they have found that insulting Muslims was fair game. However, offending Jews was not acceptable. Why? Because Jews are a minority in France, and therefore they have been protected by this code of honor, basically, whereby you do not target the minority.
Okay, Hasfa, let's just leave that there. That's the end of part one. Join us again for part two.
In the world of business, numbers tell truth. Investors seek startups and bankers provide loans. Stocks rise and fall. Traders anticipate shipments and cargo ships unload. But we at Etejah News spin the globe to bring you your weekly dose of business news.
Hello and welcome back to part two of Panorama. We're discussing freedom of speech in the wake of the Paris shootings. Elizabeth, you heard what Hassan just said, and did you want to come back to that?
Yes, very interesting, and I really appreciated Hafsa's comments about the French privacy law, which I think is It is a very interesting dynamic, the way you cannot discuss the Holocaust, of course, but very interesting dynamic that has been made law. But going back to the situation of minorities, obviously France and continental Europe is a bit different from the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, everyone's been fair game. If we look at Hogarth's engravings of the gin mothers, the drunks, the feckless classes, and he's basically satirizing their lifestyle and their reckless behavior. But I don't know if that's more of a British style than perhaps a French style. And also, I mean, I don't accept that it's bullying of a minority. I mean, if we have to acknowledge, on 4th of January 2011, Salman Taseer, governor of Punjab, standing up for the Christian Aisha Bibi, gets assassinated by his own guard for speaking up for freedom of speech and expression and wanting for Aisha Bibi to be free and to be Christian. He lost his life, a very, very brave man. So I don't really accept the dynamic that satire only attacks perhaps the ruling order. I think it attacks its focus is everywhere. If we look at
I think, sorry, Elizabeth, your example in Pakistan almost confirms the case, because Pakistan is a Muslim majority country, and therefore the Muslim majority has a responsibility towards its Christian minority, and therefore you're absolutely right. I mean, that is a heinous crime, and the man should never have died as a result. But again, we're in the same dynamic, whereas the majority actually has a responsibility towards its minority.
Okay, Euan, just very quickly, then would it be okay for me, let's suppose, to say that the number of Jews who were killed during Nazi Germany was less than 3 million? Would I be allowed to say that, and would I be allowed to promote that narrative?
Well, I would argue you should be, because you are not denying a great crime. You are discussing the statistics of it, but that's a very different issue from David Irving and company, who went too far in...
Well, let's just say with David Irving, let's go with what David Irving had said. Would that be fine then? Because it's freedom of expression, it's freedom of speech?
Yeah, I have to say my personal view would be, yes, that would be, partly and largely because, again, on the freedom of speech argument, but also because it's so ridiculous and so it's extreme that it's self-defeating, and that in a mature society would be able to defeat that by strength of argument.
But you could also argue that those in power are just that. It's not going to hurt them as much if an insult was directed towards people who are very vulnerable right now, in this case, Muslims in Europe.
Yes, I have some considerable sympathy for Hafsa's point on that. Where I would differ is I would argue, and this comes back to Liz's point about how Charlie Hebdo has been even-handed. It attacks privilege. I would argue that in the context of the current situation in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and Syria, but not just then, that criticism of Islamism and the manifestations of terrorism linked to the Hejaz and Yemen is different from criticising the downtrodden. And I accept that it is the downtrodden who become the foot soldiers. And I have some sympathy with that view. We had this in Northern Ireland as well, and certainly we're seeing it, that it is the vulnerable within the Muslim community who are often recruited and become the victims themselves and the radicals.
Well, again, both Euan and Elizabeth have argued that it was a case of attacking privilege. So my point, again, to reiterate, is that the Muslims, whether in France or across Europe, are not privileged. That's the whole point. So when you're attacking the institution of the church, you are attacking a powerful institution. And that is what political satire is about. Now, of course, attacking political Islam and Islamist groups, that's fair game for everyone. And I believe that across the Muslim world, you have newspapers who have done just that. So I don't think that there's an issue on that particular point. But coming back to David Irvine, the point that supposing I'd even refuse to acknowledge that the Holocaust ever happened, forget the figures, forget revisiting the actual figures, supposing fair enough, I want to be ridiculous, and I just want to claim that the Holocaust never happened, that it was absolutely a joke, and that it was pushed forward by a Jewish group for their agenda. So what? If we're going to argue that freedom of speech has no limitations, then why shouldn't I be able to push that agenda? And again, why shouldn't I be able to go on a newspaper in a society that is mature enough to handle the truth and actually argue my point in all the mainstream newspapers and explain to people that actually the Holocaust never happened? If there is no limits on freedom of expression, therefore that should apply to everybody.
Well, Hassan,
I wouldn't disagree.
Yes.
I don't believe Holocaust denial should be a criminal offence.
But it is. So there are limitations to freedom of speech. That is the point.
But then, Hassan, very, very quickly, and I mean, we've also heard from the French and British government about how the Muslim community should now try and do more to prevent certain attacks from happening. I mean, is this the kind of response you would expect the French and British government to do?
Well, this is exactly, if we went to the Christians in Pakistan and say, what can you do to stop fanatics from attacking you? This is absolutely ridiculous. To, again, or indeed to look at the black population in America and say, well, what are you doing to stopping racism? You know, the onus isn't on the minority to act. The minority is victim now on both strands. It's victims from the far-right movements, from attackers, but of course it's a victim of a media witch hunt, and it is, of course, again, a victim of all these groups who are targeting Muslims, whether it's in the Middle East, of course, or whether even in France, where we've seen that the first victim, actually, of the shooting was Ahmed the policeman.
OK, Euan, the British government and the French government's response to this, it does seem like they were trying to tell the Muslims, you know, you've got to do more. But of course, aren't they really trying to, you know, not get to the root cause of the problem? And that has to do a lot with not only about the issues of vilifying Muslims through satire, for instance, but also their so-called war on terror, which has caused a lot of extremism and anger amongst Muslims. And those very, you know, terrorists who did what they did, you know, are from Al-Qaeda, which the British and French governments and other governments have been, you know, aiding and helping in certain parts of the Middle East. Yeah. So why don't they also blame themselves? Why don't they say, well, we've got to do something about our own policies?
Yeah. Friends and enemies is very often a matter of timing, isn't it? We've all seen people change sides and some very unusual alliances made. I wouldn't accept that they've entirely got it wrong. I do believe that there is a strong argument for a two-way approach of encouraging the communities to cooperate with the authorities in not necessarily a criminal prosecution way, but to catch people in the bud. And it was made very clear in an interesting article in the Times yesterday that the two Kouachi brothers didn't have the best start in life and were highly vulnerable and were perhaps somewhat abandoned by the community and left them very vulnerable to radicalisation. That point has been very emphatically been made by Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the head of SIS MI6 at the time of 9/11. He strongly makes that point about how the need to identify the vulnerable to radicalisation and move in. He doesn't think it's quite as difficult as some people make out.
But what I'm trying to say is, I mean, when that happened, when the killings happened in Paris, and also in the Woolwich murder that happened now nearly 2 years ago, there was a very heightened response from the British and the French government. The way they responded, I think, also maybe charged the atmosphere. It made a lot of people here think that, oh goodness, you know, terrorists are now going to be attacking us, and it actually fueled the fire with the response of what the British and French government have done.
Well, I think we're in danger. I think we're in danger of perhaps losing the lessons that we learned in Northern Ireland the hard way after a lot of mistakes, and refined, admittedly, a very different situation, but not an entirely different situation. I think there needs to be the two-pronged approach. Suggest that to calm down some of the wilder comments in the press, particularly which seem to suggest that it's rather easier than it actually is to identify radicals and to deter them from their path, but also to genuinely build up approaches to the communities in which the radicals will arise from.
Okay, yeah, I think we will have to stop there. We've run out of time. That is the end of the first part of the two-part series. Join us next week for more of the show. Goodbye.